Pastor Stanley Ash of Christ-Centered Deliverance Ministries, Evangelistic Ministries. And today, I want to give you of myself something that I've never revealed before to anyone except for my wife. Some things that have happened in my life that was so phenomenal that I didn't see fit to explain or tell to individuals because it was so unbelievable. So at this time, God has told me to reveal these things. These are phenomenal happenings from the age of 16 years old to now. Me being 52 years old now. And these things are to allow you to know that the things that God has shown you, that things that God has spoke to you about, that you did hear from God, that God did tell you these things, and that God did show you these things. And even though you shared it with people and they said that maybe it was something that you ate that night before you went to sleep, or maybe it was some drink or drug that you used that caused you to do it, I'm here to tell you that it was the Lord. So these happenings that has happened in my life, you don't want to miss this. If you're tuning in and you're watching me, you don't want to miss this. This will change your life. And I'm going to start off with how this morning, how God told me to come and reveal this thing, that it will be a blessing. God said that Christ-Centered Deliverance Ministries is called to prophets and prophetess and handmaidens and bishops and pastors and leaders of the gospel, ministers and evangelists. So this is to cause you to live out your destiny in what God has told you, in so much in the things that He's shown you that He wants to do in your life. Now's the time for total commitment to God, because of you being called and the things that He's shown you. So I'm going to begin off with these stories. It's a few of them. And I'm going to start with these stories with, I call it the cab story. This story was when I was in the year of our Lord of 1990 or 1991. Me and my brother, he's passed away now, were street pharmacists in New York City. And not New York City, in Washington, D.C. And it got to a point to where individuals, I heard an individual say that they were more afraid of me than my brother. Because what I was doing, I was in a backslidden state. I was with God, but when my brother came, I fell away with him into sin as far as being the street pharmacist. And so the individuals was fearful because they were like, how could this guy change from God to that? So in the midst of this, I got stabbed with an ice pick. I got stabbed in my lungs and bleeding internally. And I called my girlfriend at that time, which put me in the car and rushed me, passing red lights, and got me to the hospital, of which they The doctor told me that if I'd have got to that hospital 5 or 10 minutes later than I did, that I would have drowned in my own blood because I was bleeding eternally. So after they put these tubes up in me and they drained the blood out, I came out and I held the cab, and from Washington, D.C. to Prince George's County, which is Maryland, is at least 12 to 15 minutes, maybe 20 if the cab is going slow, or if you're driving in a car, maybe you can get there within 10, 15 minutes. So, as I held this cab, I got into the cab, and it was an eerie feeling about the cab. And I got in, and it was this heavy-set black man, and skin was like creamy, putty skin. And he was immediately started talking to me, and he said, "God bless you." He says, "You know that God has a calling on your life." Now note that I didn't say nothing to this man. This man was driving. He began to tell me how that God has just saved my life. He began to tell me how God brought me to the place to where I could be in that cab listening to him. How God has shown me miraculous things, and how God has put his word in me, how the Son is going to continue, Jesus Christ is going to continue to show me miraculous things from this time forth. And he went on to continue to tell me these things, and as I listened to him, I see that we were going across the bridge to Prince George's County. So I never did really get a word in edgewise, and he stopped the car, which took about 3-4 minutes. To my surprise, we were sitting at the residence where I wanted to go. Now remember, this takes from about 15 minutes from Washington to Prince George's County. As I asked the man, I said, "Okay, how much do I owe you?" I went to give him the money, and he said, "No, you don't owe me anything." He said, "Everything that you're going to need in life is already paid for your ministry." So I was hurrying to get out that car, and when I got out the car, I got up, and I took like 1-2 steps, and I shut the door. So when I spinned around, the taxi was gone. I didn't hear no engine pull off. I didn't hear the tires screech. The cab was gone. Let alone, I never told this man where I was going. I never told this man the resident or address of anything. But yet here I was within 5 minutes, and it takes 12 to 15 minutes to get there. Now, this is that which is the phenomenal when you're called of God. And this is that which, these stories that I'm going to continue to tell, God says that has a basic on your life of what he has done and what he has shown you and what he has called you to. Now, in this year, in this season, the church is 2017 years old. If you've been in God for more than 15, 20 years, it's by now that you ought to be a teacher. You ought to be hearing from God on what he's told you to do. So, even that was like the beginning of outstanding, miraculous, almost even scary things that God had done. And I had met this woman by the name of Pastor Carolyn Johnson. And Pastor Carolyn Johnson told me that in a prophecy, at that time I was in my early 20s, I think about 21, 22. And she says to me that I was going to go in and I was going to clean up the church. And I'm thinking to myself, well, what am I going to be, a janitor? What am I going to be, the maintenance man? But since 1994 into now, I have prophesied to churches and prophesied to individuals on what thus saith the Lord. This was in order to bring them to a higher height in God. This was in order to get them to a place in God that God wants them to be. I was at a church in Bishopville, South Carolina. At that time, it was called God's Deliverance Center. And there was to where everybody in the church was praising God. We had been praising for more than 2 hours, maybe an hour and a half. And I looked up on the pulpit. The pastor was in tears, bouncing around. His 2 boys, which were like 9 and 10 years old. One was on the organ, the other one was on the drums. They got tears coming down their eyes as they're playing beautifully on the organ and on the drum. I look at my wife, Frances Ash, and she's bouncing around and tears are coming down her eyes. I'm looking at the deacons, and the deacons, all 6 of them are over there, and they're bouncing around and they're praising God. Some of them are on their knees, and I look at the congregation, and the whole congregation is tears in their eyes, and they're praising and worshiping God. At that time, it seemed like it was a sheet pulled down, and the sheet was, on it was like a news show, it's like the news. And the news, the lady said, in other news, there are these white buildings popping up all over the United States. And everywhere these white buildings popping up, drug use is down. Families are united. And crime is at an all-time low. And so the other announcer said, this was in 1994 in Bishopville, South Carolina. And the other news announcer said, so who's in charge of these white buildings? Why is these white buildings popping up all over the United States? And the lady said, you know, I'm watching this is a live vision. Nobody's seeing this but me. And the lady said, well, the minister and founder is Pastor Stanley B. Ash. And you got to remember at this time that I was not a minister. I was not a pastor. I was just brother in the Lord. So for me to see a vision that said Pastor Stanley B. Ash is the founder of this Ministries. And so it went from that vision of the news to me being on a private jet. And on the private jet, I was looking out the window. And at that time, I had no gray. I was in my 20s, but I had a little gray, like I do now, in my hair. And I took my bank book, and I was looking over New York as the private jet was coming over New York. And as I looked at my wife, and my wife was on the computer. And as it went from the computer, it went from outside the plane to the back wing of the plane. And then the back wing of the plane had this insignia. And the insignia had on, it looked at something like this. And the insignia, actually this is the insignia here, that I saw on the back of the plane. Now, as I looked at this insignia, I knew that this was my ministry. And for years after that, for at least about 8 years, I looked for this insignia. But I never found it. But even after the vision of that, all of a sudden, I seen a big eye. And the eye was, I say about as big as the flat screen TVs are now. Maybe even bigger. And the eye was bluish green pupil. The eye had, like our eyelashes, looked at like tree trunks, the eye. And so the eye was looking, and the eye kept, it was looking to the left, it was looking to the right, and then it looked back at me. And so I'm looking like, is anybody seeing this eye? And so the eye looked to the left, looked to the right, then it looked back at me. All of a sudden, everybody had calmed down, and it stopped worshiping, and the pastor came forth, and he wiped his eyes, and he said, immediately, he screamed. He said, the eye of God is watching. And I immediately jumped to my knees and it fell on my face on the floor, and I started crying before God. So the whole church is looking at me like, what's wrong with this guy? But this was the phenomenal of what God was doing. About in 2002, I was riding in Winsboro, South Carolina with my friend Lucretia Mack, and I'm driving, and I was telling Sister Mack about how that it was all these factories and all these places were shut down in Winsboro, and I pray that God will lead the pastors to do a certain thing in order to help out all these individuals, that have lost their jobs. And I hope that these pastors unite together. And at that time, God said, pray for the pastors, Pastor. And I immediately, I did like this, and Sister Max said, well, what's wrong? I said, well, God just called me a pastor. And before the remainder of that day, I said it was probably about 3 o'clock. By the time 9 o'clock had came, almost every individual that I had seen during the course of that rest of that afternoon called me pastor. So I was led to Bethel Gospel Assembly up in New York City. I was in a discipleship program. And as I was in the discipleship program, this was what, 94 to 2002. So we talking about 8 years later. And you got to remember, I was looking for this sign. Every church that I saw, I looked for this sign. I looked for, if I saw that sign, then that was the church that I was going to join, because I know I saw that vision. And so as I was at Bethel Gospel Assembly, and I'm there, and I'm in the discipleship program with Reverend Lee. He's the executive director. I was in the prayer room. We called it the sanctuary. And I'm in the prayer room, and I'm praying, and I heard the voice of God say, rise up. So as I rose up, I heard the voice of God say, get a pen, get a pen. So I got the pen, and he said, write down a C. So I wrote down a C. And he said, now write another C, but write it backwards, coming out the inside of the C. Or which, that's what it was. I immediately jumped up and started praising God, because after 8 years, here yet I was. That was the symbol. And I said, God, this was the symbol that I was looking for. I said, Lord, I thank you. And God was like, calm down, calm down. He said, this is what it is. He says, you are going to be over Christ-centered deliverance ministries, where individuals are going to get delivered from the things that alienates them from me, saith the Lord. He said, individuals are going to come through Christ. See the backward C? From a backslidden state. But this is what he said. Bishops, pastors, ministers, evangelists, prophets, and prophetess, that individuals are going to come from a backslidden state, these leaders in God, to make Christ the center of their lives again. So, even at this time of 2017, yet, piece by piece, God has given me on how to build Christ-centered ministries. Those buildings that popped up all over the United States were, I used to think that they was the 3 to 6 to 12 to 18 month live-in centers that the individuals who have come from a backslidden state, the leaders were going to go to. But then recently last year, I found out that these places, these white buildings, are recruiting stations. That the reason why crime is down, that families are united and drug use is low is because all the drug users, all the criminals, and the individuals who wouldn't come visit their family because of the neighborhood or couldn't get out to visit their family because of the neighborhood are united again because all the interlopers that's in that neighborhood were shipped out by Christ-centered stations. That's going to happen. That these stations were recruiting stations, that you come there and the individual inside the station, inside the white brick building, cinder block building, is telling you that we run a 3, 6 to 12 to 18 month live-in program, that you stay here from this amount of time to even 1 to 3 years in order to get your life back with God. There is no criteria of what you're supposed to believe, but there's a criteria of you talking with God in so much that you don't have no bills to pay, no water, no worry about water and car and home and lights and food. That only thing that you have to worry about is connecting with God. So this is a phenomenal ministry that God has given. And as he has allowed me to share this with you about Christ-centered ministries and how piece by piece is coming to pass, he wanted you to know the things that he has done. Now, I told you about the eye. I told you about the vision of the Christ Center. I told you about the worship, or how worship was going on. So here's to where, when I was with Pastor Carolyn Johnson, there was an individual that I used to try to get him to come to church every Sunday. And because he was afflicted, that he said, and I told God can heal you. And he was like, man, you're a good brother, but, I don't feel I want to go to church. Well, one day I'll go. And so one day I did get him to come. And as he came, Pastor Carolyn was giving services from our house. And Pastor Carolyn prayed for him. And as he fell out in the spirit, and he went out, he like this, and he fell out on the ground, you see his hands dropped. Everything stretched and came out. So when he woke up, I grabbed his hand and I lifted him up, and all of us are bouncing around and praising God, and I guess he probably felt that this was a crazy situation, and I told him, look at your arms, look at your hands. And when he looked and he saw that, which it wasn't no accident that he got like that, but this was from birth, that he was born like that, that the miraculous of God changed his life and changed his opinion. Now, at that time in Washington, as I was coming out my place of residence, there was a man on the other side of the street when I came out that morning. And God said to me, see that man? I said, yes, Lord. He says, I want you to tell him about me. And I said, yes, Lord. And I went to go get him, and God said, not now. I'm going to send him to you. So, about 2-3 weeks later, I was coming out my building again. The man came up to me, and he says, are you Stanley Ayers? I said, yes. This was about, I think, this is about 89, 1990, around that time. And if I'm not mistaken about the year, but I know it was closer within that area, within that time period. And he said, could you tell me about Jesus Christ? And I said, surely I could. But the phenomenal is what God said and how he sent the man. Now, when I was in the Job Corps, when I was 16 years old, I'm in the Job Corps, and I'm fresh from the Bronx. I got my pants leg rolled up. I like to wear my shirt open because I was kind of built. I knew the martial arts. I got this little pimp thing going on, like with my legs and feet. I'm bouncing as I walk. That's when I first met the Spirit of God. That's when I first met Howard, Awilda, Dana, Michelle, Cleo, Elliot. And we were individuals inside this Job Corps. And the Job Corps held 400 students, white, black, Puerto Rican. They had staff member, which is not included in the 400 for the kitchen. They had staff, which was the heads that run the place. Then they had the teaching staff. So the 400 students didn't include these individuals. So one day, me, Cleo, Awilda, Dana, Michelle, Howard, Elliot, and myself, we're out on the lawn of the Job Corps, and we're worshiping God. After we worship with God, Cleo stands up and he starts speaking about Revelations. He starts speaking about the white horse that Jesus was riding upon. So as he's speaking, all of us got our positions on the grass, but he's standing up. Now we're looking at the sky, and the sky is blue, and there's not a cloud in the sky. But yet, as he was preaching, it was this one cloud that was a ball, and it had ridges around it. And as the cloud had ridges around it, the cloud started spinning. The only cloud in the whole sky starts spinning, faster and faster and faster. Never seen nothing like that in my life. I'm at the age of 16 years old. And one of us said, hey, look at that cloud. So when all of us start looking at the cloud, and then finally when Cleo turned around and looked at the cloud, the ball, the cloud, these two things came out the cloud like if they were arms. But then two more came out, and we seen that it looked like the feet of a horse. Then all of a sudden, out of the ball came the head of a horse. Out of that came the body of the horse. This is all cloud now. Now, as the cloud body horse was standing there like this, it was like a body came out of the horse, made a cloud, and had a range which it pulled the horse neck up. Then the human type being that was coming out of the cloud of the horse stretched his hand forth like this, and his crowns of clouds started coming on his head. And then you could see the figure turn, and it looked at us, and it was like somebody poked the head of the cloud body that came out the horse to an eye, and it looked at us, and it pulled up the horse, and it did like this, and then it went, and it vanished. All of us started jumping and praising and shouting. Did you see that? Did you see that? God is still alive. God is the same today, yesterday, and forever. The same prophets that he had back then, he has now. But the same prophets that try to give what thus saith the Lord is the same prophets that are told God didn't give you that. That's not the criteria of the church. That's not the protocol. God is still working in the miraculous. That same Job Corps. Remember I told you 400 people. So me, Wilda, Dana, Howard, Cleo, Michelle, and Elliot. There were 7 of us. Or 8, including Howard. No, that's 7. And a plague went through the Job Corps. So, remember I was about 16 years old. So the plague went through the Job Corps, which was the flu. So everybody, the kitchen staff that was in the kitchen staff, could not serve the food. So the only thing they could do was come there. They would serve continental breakfast because they couldn't cook nothing because they didn't want to catch what we had. So they would put the stuff out, and then we would come through the line, and they would back up. All the teachers were absent for like about maybe a week or more because they were out sick. All the people that ran it that was higher than the teachers that ran the Job Corps didn't come in because they were sick. All 400 students in Oneonta Job Corps, Upper New York, were sick. Black, white, Puerto Rican. Sick. Except for me, Dana, Howard, Michelle, Cleo, Elliot and myself. We were walking through all the dorms, and we were walking and praying for people, and they were saying, y'all Christians put something on us. They said, how is it that everybody's sick except for y'all? Because it was the miraculous power of the Almighty. Even at that time, before this happened, I had Howard used to preach to me. And Howard, at the Job Corps, and Howard would say, if you want to connect with God, ask him things on your own and then look for an answer. So I asked God, I said, well, God, if you're real, wake me up 4 o'clock the next morning. And at that time, I was on a bunk bed. I'm on the top bunk. I was asleep. All of a sudden, I felt a cool wind. And the cool wind actually lifted me up, put my legs on the side to hang over the bed. And as I was sitting there and I'm asleep, I felt the cool wind. And I opened my eyes. I looked at the clock. It was 4 a.m. on the dot. So I jumped down and I started praising the Lord. I started lifting up to him because of the miraculous answer that he had did. Now, there was to where in the early 90s that me and my wife, when we was going to God's Deliverance Center, and after I saw that vision that I told y'all about with the eye and how God showed me and my wife on the private jet, and that we had built these centers all over the United States. And after that, between the year, let me see if I can find this here. Between the year of 1994 and 1995, out of 25 to 30 different churches, every single church out of 25 to 30 churches that me and my wife went into, they called me out. Every single time. It got to a point that one day we went to this church, and it was, I say, about maybe 400 people there. So me and my wife said, we're going to sit all the way in the back because we want to see if the preacher still call us out. And we sat all the way in the back in the overflow section. And sure enough, here was the individual that was preaching and said, you, young man with the vest on, come up here. And so what happened so many times before, exactly out of the 25 and 30 people of the whole year of individuals who called me and my wife out, told me the exact same thing. That God has called you to a prophet to the world. God has called you to help individuals that after they come from a backslidden state to come to know Jesus again. God has called you that after the individuals come to a certain place in God, that now it's time for them to come up to a higher height and deeper depth. And every single pastor, minister, evangelist that called us out said the same exact thing. So as I was at Bethel Gospel Assembly and I was in the school part, they called me minister, but I was not yet minister yet. And they called me minister because of the phenomenal understanding of the word that God had gave. And at that time, the executive director was Reverend Lee. He had assistant director, he had ministers under the assistant director, then you had the other lead people. So Reverend Lee came to me and started doing which was unregular in the school. He started bringing me with him when he went preach. Whenever the disciples went somewhere, I was on the pulpit. And he started telling me that God was telling him things of where I would be. It got to a point that he called me up to his office one day and said to me, I want you to clean out this office. After I finished cleaning out the office for like 2 days, he said, this is your office, and I want you to be in this office. He had other different prophets and prophetesses. He had other different ministers come and give me a word and say certain things to me, and I didn't know what was going on. Until finally, maybe after a month, he says to me, he says, I'm grooming you to be the executive director of discipleship, which came with a nice salary, which came with, leadership. And I declined because I remembered what God had shown me about me being over my own ministry. And how could I be over my own ministry and be over this one at the same time? So I declined it. Reverend Lee was in tears. And he said, I know I see what God is showing me. Then how then could you not accept this position? Before I go on with this story, I want to tell you that while I was in there, I told the crew that of the discipleship program that everybody was feeling kind of bad about themselves, that we was the lowest ministry outside of, like, I think it was like about 70 different ministries in the 2,000-seat church. And we were in the basement. The school was in the basement, so that kind of made us feel, not me, but it made the other individuals feel like we were the lowest ministry. And I began to tell them that Reverend Lee was going to get in front of the whole 2,000 people and call each one of us by name to say who we were in the Lord. About 2 weeks later, it happened. Now, Reverend Lee didn't sit on the pulpit, but at this time, he did. 2 weeks later, he did, and he did exactly what I told the people. I told the people that the assistant director who was there for 10 years was going to be fired for, not so good things that he was doing in the house of God. 2 days later, he was fired. So, even as I didn't take this position, because I knew that it was time for me to come back down south to my wife, I went to one of the top ministers and I said, minister, God has shown me a vision. And God gave me the vision of being over a deliverance ministry. I said, now Reverend Lee asked me to be executive director, and he said, I heard about that. And he says, I heard that you declined it. He said, whatever reasons you have, son, if you hearing from God, you stick with it. So I felt some kind of way because I'm turning up this opportunity. I'm coming back down south to Bishopville with no job. I'm coming back down to no ministry, no job, just going back to my wife for where, whatever I needed to eat or whatever, she would have had to supply. So I'm thinking that maybe, I'm not thinking right. But I know I heard from God. So about 3 days before I left, which I was leaving on that Tuesday, that Sunday, the senior pastor preached on your vision from God. He preached on the voice, the dreams, and the miraculous things that God has done in your life that you did hear from God. And I thought that this was kind of a beautiful coincidence. I thought that this was a great send-off because I know I heard from God. So after the service, the preaching came to an end. He says, okay, I want everybody who got a vision from God to come up. At that time, the minister that I talked to was in the midst of, I say, about 15 other ministers who began to get there with their priest collar on and ties, and the women ministers and prophetess, they all lined up. So as the people come forth, hundreds and hundreds of people was coming forth to get prayed for their vision. I was coming down, and everybody's going to their separate ministers as the deacons say, okay, go to this minister, go to that minister, go to this minister, go to that minister. When I got to the front of the line, after hundreds and hundreds of people, remember it was 2,000 seats or more there. When I got down to it, and I looked at the minister that was open for me, it was the minister that I told my vision to. And as tears began to come down my face and I began to walk towards him, this was 2002, and I began to walk towards him, tears began to come down his face, and he said, ain't no coincidence that you're coming to me, because you're the one that gave me that which God had gave you about your vision. Come on, let me pray for you, son. Come on, let me pray for you. So, what we're doing is we're telling the miraculous stories of what God had done. The miraculous stories of how God had spoke certain things. Okay? There was a time to where I was in Winsboro, South Carolina. So I'm in Winsboro, South Carolina, and I'm on the pulpit, and I'm a young minister, so all the older ministers that was on the pulpit were saying certain things, and I felt that I needed to say a certain thing because I heard from God, but they felt that I needed to say a certain thing because I was trying to be with the big boys. I say it was about like 6 or 7 pastors on the thing. I was a minister, I was evangelist, I didn't yet have my own church yet, excuse me. And I said that I had a word. And the biggest minister at that time, he was the top bishop over the churches. And I said I had a word for him. So, as I said I had a word for him, you can hear the things in the audience of the individuals going, ah, man, So, he's just trying to shine. So, I gave a word that God gave to me, and I said, I see the bishop on television. I said, I see the bishop preaching to thousands and thousands of individuals. And so I said that, and I sat down. And then the bishop came forth and said, hearken unto what the young minister was saying. Because he says, for the past 3 months, the cable people have been at my church, hooking up all the wires, hooking up all the cameras in the back, in the top of the ceiling, at the front door, because that following Sunday, they were going to be on cable. One time, throughout my years, I had rented a truck. And when I went to go rent this truck, the lady said that they got a policy and they're going to give an extra day. So as they gave this extra day, it was kindly taken. I said, yo, thank you. I got an extra day with the truck. But when I came back with the truck, the lady wasn't there. And the individual said to me, you got to pay this money for this extra day. And I said, I'm not going to pay this money for this extra day because it was given to me. And they said, well, where's the proof? I said, well, the young lady. And they said, well, what young lady? So finally got to a point that I wasn't going to pay. If I don't pay, they're going to call the police. I said, call the police, let's get this thing straight. They called the police, I got arrested. So as I got arrested, I went to jail. And I'm like, Lord, what's going on? You're my Savior. Why are you allowing this to happen to me? You know that I'm innocent of this. And as I was there, I was in the jail. I prophesied to some individuals that was in the jail cell. But this one individual, when they let us out for rep, he was a big man. A big, bald-headed man. And he was standing in the midst with a suit on of these 2 correctional officers who was big themselves. And God told me to go up to that man and say to that man, that not only am I going to make you warden over this prison, but I'm going to make you warden over 2 other prisons. You're going to be warden over 3 prisons. So as I listened to the man, and the man was telling the other officers, he was saying, why is they keep looking me over? He said, every time the position comes for me to be warden over this jail, a nephew gets it, or somebody from the outside gets it. He said, I've been here for years. When is my turn coming? Not knowing that this man was a pastor over a ministry, I went up to him and I told him what thus saith the Lord. That not only are you going to be warden over this prison, but you're going to be warden over 2 other prisons. So, about a half a year later, me and my wife is in the Sumter Mall, and we walking down, and the Spirit of God said, look, watch, there's the man. And the man was coming, the bald-head individual, and he, big black individual, and he was coming and he spotted me. We were coming towards each other. The Spirit of God said, that's his wife. The male and female to the side is his mother and father. And so when I got up to him, he said, hey. He said, young man, how you doing? He said, do you remember me? I said, yes, sir, I remember you. He said, well, this is my mother, this is my father, and this is my wife, so-and-so and so-and-so. So he said, remember what you told me? I said, yes, sir, I do. He says, well, I'm not only warden of that prison, but I'm warden over 2 other prisons. It was 2 or 1. I don't want to give false testimony, but it was 2 or 1 prisons that he was over. Just showing you, giving you the things that what God has done from 1991 as far as the prophetic in the Lord of what God was doing, and how that from this time forth, when I come to you on 10 a.m. on the Sabbath days, how that you could see that God been working in my life for years, and how the things that's going to come forth, that's going to help establish your ministry, that you could receive and accept because of the miraculous workings of Almighty God. Now, there was another church where I was on the pulpit, and I leaned over and I said to an individual that I have a message for your church. So, as I was leading and asking this individual that, he says, okay, I'll give you room to speak. So, the first one, when he gave me the mic, I went up to this very lovely young lady on the choir. And I spoke to her and I said to her, I said that there is to where you are dating a man who's older than you. You being at a young age, I believe she was like 15, 16, but very attractive. Maybe she looked it like she was older. And I said that God said that this man means you no good. That this man is going to drive your life to the pits. That you need to back off from this young man and finish with your studying and finish your school and listen to your mother. I then stepped down and I went to another individual, and I said that God said he's going to do this for you. That God says that if you will allow him and that you will wait on him, I'm going to do it for you, saith the Lord. This individual bust out crying and went to praising God. I went and I walked down the aisle, and it was this woman. She looks like she's in her early 40s. And I said to the woman, I said, God misses his time with you. I said, your time with God, God is saying that there was to where a father and a daughter holding hands, running through a meadow of beautiful yellow, purple, and white flowers. And God said, I miss my time with you. And the woman began to cry and bust out. And so after the service, I was riding with the pastor, and the pastor began to tell me that the young lady was dating an individual that him, the pastor, the mother, been trying to get her to stop seeing this young man. And me just coming to that church and me prophesying that maybe this will help her. The young man that I went to was an individual who was a great singer. So, praise God. I had a phone call coming in. We'll check the phone call later. Let me see how long I've been talking here. They don't show it. So, but there was a lot that I had planned on giving today, but it looked like I'm gonna have to cut it because it's a lot, and I believe that I've been talking almost an hour. I may be wrong, but he had told me that the individual had a great voice and was singing for the Lord, and that people had offered him money to sing R&B, but he wanted to sing for the Lord. So he wanted to sing for the Lord. So it was like he was waiting, and he wanted to hear a word from God to say that God was with him. And so the message that God gave me to give to him was for his help. Now, the other lady that was in her early 40s, he told me that that lady was a minister in the church and that she was gone for maybe like a year and a half, and this was her first time coming back to the church. So, just the phenomenal things that God has given, the visions, dreams, and the voice of God that he has shown me, I desire to give more. If you tune in, again, when I do another live broadcast, as God directs, I'll give you more of the miraculous of what God has done in my life. But stay tuned, 10 a.m., Sabbath day morning, which is Saturday, that I promised you on the second day of the week through this through the Facebook, that I would tell you the mysteries that have been hidden since ages past, the phenomenal mysteries of the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, that I was going to give you some more insight of what the Word says about them. And you tune in Sabbath morning, we're going to go deep. So I thank you at this time and look forward to the next broadcast of me telling you, let's see all these papers, of me telling you the phenomenal things that God has done in the life of a prophet. Bless you. Love you.